Hello, GDC, and welcome to my talk called Mutazione Visualized. The next hour, I will let you in on the visual universe of Mutazione, where we're going to talk about how our wonderful craft is connected to all other creative crafts in game development. And I'm talking mostly about the visual arts. I will focus a lot on the connection between art and writing in this talk. And the other thing I want to talk about is how we can create a coherent and credible game world with believable and relatable characters. But first, a quick introduction. My name is Niels Deneken. I came to game development from a background of visual communication and graphic design. And I got here through like a lucky coincidence, really, by finding the Independent Games Festival and sending my student project in. And in 2008, I started Die Gute Fabrik. One reason was because it was a requirement from the IGF to be part of the student showcase. No regrets, though, and we still exist, so that's amazing. I met a bunch of wonderful people through going to festivals that year, which I ended up making games with, some of them at least. And a few of them even ended up joining me at Die Gute Fabrik. Also, 2008 was a significant year for some other reasons, because that's where I drew the first concepts for this game called Mutazione. This is the game I actually kept coming back to over the years, even though I also worked on other projects. But it kind of haunted me for over a decade, to be honest. And in 2016, we were so fortunate to secure some serious funding for the game from Sony and go into production. And from that also still took a long time, and we learned a lot from it. And I hope I can share some of those lessons with you. On Mutazione, I wore a lot of hats. I did the world and character creation. I came up with a basic storyline. I was the creative director when we got into production. I was part of the design team, and but the part that I want to talk about and focus on is being art director and lead artist, and so that's also the part of the job I'm most comfortable with and able to share some insights about. One insight is I fucking love my job. I think it's one of probably the best jobs I could imagine, and here's why. What you can do with the medium of games is still largely unexplored, which I really like. And in terms of art direction and visual design, there's still so much that hasn't been explored within games specifically. So I'd like to keep doing that and try to push that. Also, as someone with a graphic design and illustration background, creating the art and the visual identity for a game at the scale that we're working at is an absolute treat. I'm involved in all parts of the production, which means I can shape the identity of a game from the beginning to the end. The only downside with this might be that there's I wish there was more time for each of those steps. So I also learned that I'm not so averse to share that workload anymore. And that is another insight, I guess. Let's get to point 3, and that's the main thing we're going to talk about. So there's a connection to all the other departments of the development team, and I'm working together with writers, musicians, and programmers, and designers, and other artists, animators, and so on. And everyone is very passionate about their job and the vision, and together we create this super complex entity, in our case, a narrative game. And all those people, they have their own idea and vision of the game, and ideas in their head how the game is supposed to be, right? But even if I'm not the creative director, like I was here in Mutazione, I can help as like a art person. I can help make the process smoother. So here's the coolest thing. With the art I create, I complement all the other departments, right? And you could say that with every decision I'm making when I create visuals, I would tell stories and complement the writer's work. And through the colors and shapes and styles and compositions that I'm using, I create and complement the music and the sounds of the game. And with everything we put on the screen, it is read, it's decoded, it's interacted with, and part of the design process, and complements all other aspects of the game design. I'm not saying that when I say I'm also the writer, then I'm not saying that I'm starting to write dialogues or something. But I'm like another side of a coin, so to speak, of the story coin, right? Just like the musician is also a part of that kind of writing, music connection, right? So we kind of complement each other. And this might feel overwhelming, but once you get used to the idea, it actually can make you safer and strengthen the connection to the other members of your team. And acknowledging that we're not isolated in our craft, and that we're working on something that's much bigger than ourselves. And that helps us to create a unified and coherent experience, right? So this connection and the communication that we need to the other departments. And so what I'm not saying is that we can't have contradictions and brokenness, or embrace happy accidents in our work, right? But that should be a conscious decision and not come from something where there's brokenness in the game because there's been a lack of communication between each department, right? And another cool thing about it is it can take kind of the ego out of the process, this kind of urge to prove yourself and to make a mark, right? Because you're together in this. You're part of that team, and you kind of push this thing to a new height together. And if we acknowledge that we're all those other roles, we can also acknowledge that the other are artists and create images, which get channeled through us, and we implement that, and we're in service of that, right? So, and all of these insights that might improve our communication with those departments, and also improve our ability to receive feedback and criticism. So there are concrete steps which we can take to improve that connection. So one thing is, like for us at the art team to read the story and the world and the character Bibles. That's kind of obvious, but those get updated. So, just keep up to date with what's going on. We should have regular story and art catch-up meetings where we can talk about progress and thoughts and character development, or how we imagine a place, or whatever is coming up in the production. We should update each other with progress and point out blind spots, so that, upload your images and progress on the channel so you can get feedback from the writers team or the creative director, because some of the details in your art might, be something that they haven't imagined. And, that doesn't have to be a bad thing. You can, fix that, or they adjust their process, but it's something that you need to coordinate, right? Talk about the blind spots when you see, like, hey, in this document, you wrote this and this, but that contradicts with how we build up the world here, and, talk about that, resolve those conflicts. Or, for example, okay, this detail in the story, it's easy when you write it, but for the art team, we're gonna spend 3 days of implementing that, because suddenly we have to draw this whole new, whatever, background or dream sequence or whatever. So point each other to those blind spots, because we all think differently, right? People who don't think visually, everyone thinks in different ways. So that's good, so that's why we need to be connected. And the other thing is, like, when you see gaps in the writing or in the direction that are not filled yet, then come with proposals and cool stuff you can fill those with, right? If, not every little detail in the World Bible or the Story Bible will be filled with content, right? Because we're working with visuals, we might work on a much more detailed level, so we can use our imagination and be inspired by each other, right? It's another sip of water. So this is basically one of the things that, once you acknowledge that, it just totally got me excited about working with games and working with art, and realizing that, hey, we are not isolated, right? We are creating story. And I think that's actually quite awesome. Another thing with that, way of updating each other and being connected to those processes is also that you can you realize that game development is a fluent process, right? So you suddenly you might be forced to change direction. Sometimes because of external forces, budget cuts, production plans, publisher approval, it can change. There can be internal dynamics and findings like testing, iteration, dialogue within departments, or new creative directions. So, and being updated and coordinated about that definitely helps being aware of those things that are going on. So it's funny how, those realizations about game development and about our craft have actually pretty strong connection to the themes that are happening in Mutazione. And that's probably not a coincidence. 13 years ago, when I started on that project, I didn't consciously think about these connections and processes, obviously. That was like a learning process. And those realizations took time to shape and grow along with the game, which also grew in a quite organic way. So I want to try to recreate just a bit of that journey. In case you're not familiar with Mutazione, Mutazione is a narrative game. We call it a mutant soap opera. It's about a teenage girl called Kai who visits her sick grandfather, a shaman in the desolated village of Mutazione. Over the course of the game, Kai helps her grandfather, gets to know the community of the village, learns about spiritual journeys, and grows musical gardens. And as a player, you mainly walk around, talk to people, and plant musical gardens. 13 years ago, not much of that was very clear. It all started with a few concept drawings. One of them you can see here. This is the game world I wanted to create. At the center of the game world would be a village, and in the middle of a swamp, and it was inhabited by mutants. So the whole idea of having that kind of ensemble cast, or this group of people, this composition of people, was already present in the very first concepts of the game. The setting is post-apocalyptic, and you can find ruins and artifacts from the world that we know in those areas. I drew a couple of other nice scenes, and this concept actually made it into the final game as one of the backgrounds. So the ones, if you have played the game, you definitely recognize that. So the world felt captivating, but I didn't have like a concrete idea what the game would be. I had, some ideas were actually crystallizing. I wanted to make a game that I wanted to play myself. So I want the game to be relaxing and not stressful, because I'm a horrible gamer myself. Like, I'm not very good at gaming. I don't want to use violence as a game mechanic. I think at that time that might have been less a thing. So for me, that was kind of revolutionary. I want to spend time in this world. I want to spend time in the game world, and I want to explore the world in my own pace. I want characters with depth, and they should not be just set pieces or quest givers or providers of resources. And I would like to have direct character control. Basically, the dream was also to make this for console from the beginning, using a controller. And I don't want the controls of the game to be particularly challenging. So they should be simple. Maybe just use one button and a thumbstick. We used a few more buttons, but it's very easy to use and play. So at some point I thought I could condense those ideas into a platformer game. I always really enjoyed those platformers like Another World or Flashback, those that had a realistic character, and they were 2D, and I was really captivated by those games. I just thought Another World was way too hard, for me at least. So we got DFI funding in 2009 and made a prototype, but it was a failed experiment. We didn't really focus on the core of the game. We made one level of a dream sequence that was happening at the intro of the game. It was not a relaxing experience, and it was actually quite hard. And we didn't show any characters from the village or of that kind of basic game world in the core that we wanted to that was part of that vision. So it was actually totally missing the original vision of the game. Kind of a mess. But we learned from that. So what I did was, after that, I went back to the drawing board. And, while other projects were happening, and I spent more time thinking about the village in the center of the game. So this is the very first drawing of the village of Mutazione, and that kept evolving. I wanted the village to be situated around the giant trees, so suddenly you had more of a center of that village, right? And the idea of putting a really big tree into the middle of that village actually had had a lot of consequences for the game world and for the story, how I discovered at a later point. Back then, I didn't really think about that. It was okay, we'll just put a tree in there. That's cool. The architecture was supposed to be ramshackle buildings made from scraps that the inhabitants would find in the environment. And there would be that combination of those, self-made buildings and old architecture from before the apocalypse. So you see, the village kept evolving, and it, became more and more concrete. So these last two sketches, I even made a colored concept, which I actually really liked. I liked the vibes and the color of those older concepts, but it was always very dark, and it seemed always to be nighttime. And at some point, we introduced a day-night cycle into the game, and the game got a bit lighter while it still had this kind of swampy atmosphere. But I really liked the concepts here. The village kept evolving. I kept working with it, and at some point, we added a gondola to the village, which looked really cool. But I kind of had more and more considerations about the logic of this world, right? So everything is really close to the water here, but what happens if the water level rises because of a flood or something, right? So how do they protect themselves from that? So all these considerations kind of went into the game, and that was I guess that was, just world building that happened without me actually being that conscious about it. Just thinking about the internal logic of the game and the universe. So I raised the level of the buildings, added some bridges to it, and this was a pretty detailed sketch. at some point, and you can already recognize a lot of, if you know the game, you can recognize a lot of the buildings already. You have Spike's Bar, and you have the Maurice Stir Fry, and you can see Kai's house and Miu's house, and so on and so on. So there's like, this is basically, it's very close to what we already have. Still has the gondola, which I at some point took away because it didn't really serve any purpose in the story. So it just had to go. And that's actually the layout of the village, how we ended up with this. No gondola station, but a little lighthouse in the end, and a giant tree in the middle. This is the in-game map from the game, which shows the final layout of the village. And yeah, that's what you can see. So, but what, through this whole process of building this world, what did we learn from this process, right? There are like a couple of considerations when building a game world and a game space. But I will focus, like, there's the historical grounding, there's characterization, and there's gameplay and navigation. That's super important, of course. And there's the level of abstraction, which has mostly to do with what are our resources, how much money do we have to create this game, right? But also how many assets do we want to make, right? If we have a lot of characters, a lot of backgrounds, and a lot of moving parts, then, it might make sense to have a much more radical level of abstraction than we have here. I think the world of Mutazione for our scale is actually quite detailed. But, there's also a reason why it took so long to make. But I want to focus on the top two parts, and that's historical grounding and characterization. Historical grounding. So Mutazione village and the world around it is an improbable place, right? It's a fantasy world. So we need to give it a narrative that makes this place credible and gives it a backstory. This helps us when we draw backgrounds, and it allows us to create assets for it purposefully. And this also helps this helps the world to create a story on its own. So in our case, we have this post-apocalyptic overgrown setting, and that was created by a meteor impact that has happened around a century ago. So the area of the catastrophe used to be a holiday resort in the 70s era, like a whole town, holiday town. And it was flooded after the catastrophe, so that explains the swamp and the architecture of some of the ruins. The meteor crash adds a fantastical element to the history of the place. So that, provides an explanation for the mutations of plants, animals, and intelligent life. And also why all of this growth has happened in a relatively short time span. So that's, I would call that kind of the historical grounding of the world. So, and you don't need to tell all of that to the players. I think, it's nice if they can discover little hints about the world, but you need to be clear about those rules within your narrative design team, and so all of that needs to be defined, but let the player discover that by themselves, and don't necessarily dump the whole exposition on them, because that can be very tiring and boring. But let's get back to the world of Mutazione. So where the impact of the meteor was, it was like a giant tree that grew from its impact, and at some point, the village of Mutazione was kind of settled or situated around that tree. And the tree, has lives in symbiosis with this giant mushroom, which also plays an important role in the story. And this giant mushroom is very powerful and has dangerous properties. For example, it caused the death of a group of scientists who came to Mutazione in the past to conduct research on the area. And one of the survivors of that team of scientists is Kai's, the main character's grandfather, who is, turned out to be the spiritual leader of the village, of the shaman. So that's kind of how we weave, these personal backstory elements and the world history together through that connection, among others. There's also other connections. But let's get to characterization, right? So the village of Mutazione does not only reflect the history of the place, what happened in the past, but it also reflects the characters of that community who lives there. So that's pretty interesting. So its visualization reflects the inhabitants' values, their relationship with the giant tree in the center, the practicalities of everyday life that they live, and the challenges that are imposed by the environment. So how do they deal with that there's a swamp, that there's a tree, that there might be weird animals and plants around. So this, all of this applies both to individual characters and the community of the village. So, we need to face the elephant in the room, which is like the giant tree in the center of the village. It has major consequences for the construction of the place and its characters, and it's much more than a cool set piece. Eventually, we made it pretty central to the story of the game. But even if it wasn't part of the main storyline, it would be kind of crucial to the visual narrative of the place. Because what happens with such a giant tree in the center, it creates, verticality, and there's the whole tree that spans from the roots to the canopy, right? And it becomes the home for this community, and some of the characters' daily lives revolve around that tree. So this is Jale, who lives at the roots of the tree. And you have different creatures and niches on every level, basically, which have different purposes and a different way of living, and have adapted to the different conditions and biospheres of the tree, like the dots here. But there's more to the village than, just the creatures that are dependent on or adapted to or catering to the puppetry. Most characters are human-like in this game, and they have lives similar-ish to our daily lives. They eat, they drink, sleep, they love, grieve, contribute, and search for purpose. They search for knowledge or meaning. They have relations, friendships. They argue with each other. They are, excessive once in a while. So we have a whole village community that reflects those places. So there's a restaurant, a bar, a harbor, a library, a bathhouse, and hair salon, and people that have jobs: an engineer, a plumber, a builder, a hunter. There's a shop, there's a chemist, and there's a shaman. And each of those places is visualized with, not only their function in mind, but also with, the characters inhabiting it or working there. So they're, extensions of the character's characteristics. So, and I think that's, just as important, a way to characterize characters than it is to portray their character designs or the tone of the voice in their writing, right? Because that tells you so much about who the characters are is by the spaces they inhabit. So, and most of the characters have their own space in which you can normally find them. And that, also makes it easier for the player to remember them and find them in the game world. And, for example, you have a place like the home of Miyu, who is your neighbor in the game. And if you look at her house, you can see that, okay, she's a really tough, badass hunter. She has all these trophies. But, she also cares for her home and wants to make it a nice place. There's like personal items there, like a little hang in there kitty poster that she got from Spike. The player doesn't know that, but we can imagine that. She has a bit of a Baroque taste. She, like the paintings that she has, the chandelier and the furniture. She's listening to music. So we have these different elements that are reflected in her apartment, which also shows that she's both vulnerable and tough and a complex character, right? And something that is not just a stereotype. And we have other places too, right? We have not all of the places are personal places. Some of them are places where the community meets as friends or family or in their professional lives. So that, it's another layer to the space of the village of Mutazione. So the characters are not just isolated, they eat together, at family dinners, or they meet at the bar to hang out, which is something that a lot of us would love to do, I guess, at the moment. So to create this kind of believable game world, we need to create those spaces for those meetings too, where people can meet, right? And spaces inhabited by the community. Another thing that we did in Mutazione, which I find quite important to characterize the NPCs, was that we just when we showed them, we always embedded them in their environments. So they would always do something, that you would do at that space. You would not, for example, just show them the idling, standing around and idling and waiting for the main characters. So if you would meet Bopek and Tang in the bar, they would, they might play arcade together and talk about that, would be involved in that conversation. It would not be characters waiting, idling somewhere and waiting for the player character to come by and drop their quest on the player character. So, and that created, more work because we had to create more animations, but also that, made that place believable. So let's zoom in on one of the characters. So this is Tang. And Tang, he's one of the NPCs from Mutazione, and he's a big mutant around Kai's age. And he is a bit insecure and shy, but he's also gentle. And but once in a while, he has fits of rage, which is, can be very scary for the people around him. He also loves to watch telenovelas, which you find out through the game. Tang is one of the few characters that have both inside and outside spaces that kind of belong to him. So he has a yard close to the harbor where he has a lot of stuff that he uses for building material. He's the builder of the town. He's constructing stuff and helping and fixing some of the houses in Mutazione. And so in the span of the game, you kind of follow him, how he fixes up a boat from like a wreck kind of condition to a finished boat. And you have, go on a boat trip with him and you. So that's kind of how we kind of follow this character, right? Throughout the game, every day you meet him in his yard, and the boat has come along slightly from the previous day, and you can talk about that with him. So it's a very real kind of activity. And so, and in the end, you even have that payoff that, okay, he's finished that boat, so, and you're actually going to use it, which is which I find really rewarding, that, you go on this boat trip together and you have followed this character's progress. So that's one of the ways how we can ground this person, right? And emphasize and build up this relationship with him. This is where he lives. I wish we had more time to show him in his place in the game, but you normally meet him when he's watching TV. But, you can read a lot about his character from the place that he inhabits, right? He seems not to be that interested in preparing food or, cleaning up the kitchen. You can see tools and dirty dishes in the same staples. But you can see he also likes to tinker with motorized vehicles, and he seems to be a bit more sorted in that way, with as being a mechanic. He has a bunch of racing memorabilia on the wall, and by knowing that Mutazione is super desolated, there's no working roads or events like that happening. Or no, you don't see like a car or motorcycle anywhere driving around. You can imagine that this fascination of the racing world is something similar to a child's fascination that might have never actually seen a real car race or motorcycle race or something. So maybe he's seen that in the movies, or I don't know. But it definitely talks more about his kind of childlike fascination of that. But he likes his home. You can see that it's kind of cozy, despite the scale of it and the slight messiness. And another fun fact is that this is the place of the game, the only place in Mutazione where I went to do location scouting, which was actually a lot of fun. I didn't do that for most of the other, well, actually for none of the other places, but tons. And so we looked at Tang, at his character design, we looked at his environments. So what we can do now is take a look at Tang's main relations in the village, because characters are not isolated, they always live in relation to other characters and how they talk about them, or what their role is in relation to other characters. So Tang is related to Claire, who is his mother, and Mori, who is Tang's grandmother and the mother of Claire. His dad, Gong, was a human, but he left when Tang was a child. So we never see him. And after his father left, Dennis, the plumber and engineer of the village, took him under his wing and taught him constructions and crafts. So he plays in a band with Mew, who is also his best friend, and Spike, who is Mew's human stepfather and bar owner. And they perform together at the bar on Fridays. So they actually do things. He plays regularly at the arcade with Bopek, who is his other best friend, and he fishes regularly with Spike and Bopek, and he plays in the band. So, he has things to do in the village, and beside fixing up his boat and watching telenovelas or hanging out at the campfire. He also has a crush on Aiden, and we discover throughout the game that he's also the father of her unborn child, which he himself is not aware of, and neither is Aiden's boyfriend, Graubert. So now you have the whole kind of circle of Tang's relations in Mutazione. And at last, but not least, you have he's also defined by his relation to the player character. And we see his journey through her eyes and befriend him and spend time with him through her. But also they have, a relation. So I guess the conclusion is that, the characters should not only be their visual representation and have a few traits or stats. They are, both defined by their relation to the world around them and also to other characters. They have agency and motivations. They influence other characters' lives and form the environment around them. Yeah, this is just a picture that shows each of the characters in their space, and some of their relations. But I don't have that much else to add to that. So thank you very much for coming and listening. And I hope you enjoyed the talk and got something out of it. If you're interested on more thoughts, then look at some of the articles on gutefabrik.com. There's also a lot of other really good writing and articles that you can check out. And check out Mutazione if you haven't. And if you're interested, follow me on Twitter. Thank you and goodbye, GDC.